Hello, my dear friends. Welcome back. Come in. Sit down. I'm very glad you're here tonight. Tonight, I want to tell you a story that begins in the coldest, darkest kind of place. A story can begin a battlefield. In winter, in 1950. And I want to tell you how a single act of human tenderness in that darkness became one of the most quietly beautiful love stories of the 20th century. Not a romantic love story, something older and deeper than that. The love between a father and a daughter, between two people who had no reason in the world to belong to each other, and chose to anyway. Let me take you to Korea, November 1950. The Korean War is at one of its most brutal moments. China has just entered the conflict, pushing United Nations forces back with massive force. The peninsula is cold, chaotic, and full of suffering. Among the soldiers fighting under the UN flag are the men of the Turkish brigade. Turkey had sent nearly 15,000 troops to Korea, one of the largest contributions of any UN member nation outside the United States. They were not wealthy men. They were not fighting for strategic territory or national interest in any obvious sense. They had come because a small nation was being overrun, and Turkey believed that mattered. One of those soldiers was a 25-year-old sergeant named Süleyman Dilbirli. Süleyman was a young man from a small Turkish town who had signed up for what he imagined might be something like an adventure. He had a girl he wanted to marry when he got home. He had a whole life waiting. Then his unit was ordered to search the woods near a destroyed village. What he found there has never left the people who heard him describe it. A small girl, 5 years old, sitting alone in the snow, clutching the hand of her dead mother. Her entire family had been killed. She had no one. There was nothing around her but wreckage and silence and the cold. She looked up at Süleyman. He could not leave her there. He simply could not do it. He picked her up and carried her back to the Turkish garrison. He had no idea what her name was. She spoke no Turkish. He spoke no Korean. For those first days, they communicated through nothing but touch and warmth, and the look in each other's eyes that said, "I see you. I will not let go." He named her Ayla. In Turkish, it means the halo of light around the moon. He said it was because her face was bright in the moonlight on the night he found her. What happened over the next 14 months is the kind of thing that sounds impossible until you understand that children are extraordinarily resilient, and that love, genuine, patient, consistent love, can cross any language barrier ever built. Ayla learned Turkish, not slowly, not haltingly. She absorbed it the way young children absorb everything, completely and naturally. Within months, she was fluent, enough to translate between the Turkish soldiers and Korean civilians. A 5-year-old girl, orphaned in a war zone, had become the interpreter for an entire military brigade, and that brigade had become her family. It was not just Süleyman who cared for her. The whole camp adopted her. The Turkish soldiers brought her food and clothes, and found in her a reason to smile, in a place that gave very few reasons to smile. She was, as one account put it, the joy and the mascot of the entire brigade. In the middle of a war, this small girl, with her bright eyes and her rapidly expanding Turkish vocabulary, reminded hundreds of men what they were fighting for. Süleyman cared for her the way a father cares for a daughter. He watched over her, worried about her, planned for her. When the time came for the Turkish brigade to withdraw from Korea, he tried everything he could think of to take her with him. He appealed to officers. He tried to navigate the bureaucratic requirements. He refused, for as long as he could, to accept that it was not possible. In the end, he had to leave her behind. She was placed in a Korean orphanage that the Turkish government had established for Korean children who had lost their families, a place called the Ankara School. Süleyman said goodbye to a little girl who called him her father. She watched him go. Neither of them had any idea when or whether they would ever see each other again. He returned to Turkey. He married. He built a life. But Ayla stayed with him. For 6 decades, Süleyman carried her in his heart. He told almost no one. He searched for her in small ways, in the ways available to a man, without resources or connections. When Turkey played in the 2002 World Cup in South Korea, he sat in front of his television and watched the crowds in the stands, scanning thousands of Korean faces, hoping irrationally he knew to catch a glimpse of the little girl, who was by then a woman in her late 50s. He never found her. The years passed. Suleiman grew old. In 2010, when he was 85 years old, he attended a reception in Turkey, marking the 60th anniversary of the Korean War. He was surrounded by fellow veterans, by Turkish and Korean officials, by the formal commemorations of old battles. And Suleiman, who had carried a secret for 60 years, told his story. A Korean journalist in the room heard it. The search began. Government archives were checked. The records of the Ankara school were sought. But the school had been demolished decades earlier to build a park, and the records had been destroyed with it. The trail seemed to go cold. And then a man watching the news story came forward. He said his sister had known Ayla at the Ankara school. She had stayed in touch with her for years after graduation. Her name was Kim Eun-ja. The Korean government found Kim Eun-ja. She was 65 years old. She had lived her whole life in Korea, had married, had a family, and she remembered the Turkish soldier who had carried her out of the snow when she was 5 years old. The reunion was held in 2010 in Seoul. They chose the park that had been built on the ground where the Ankara school once stood, the place where Suleiman had left her 60 years before. When they saw each other, Suleiman took her in his arms. He said, "It is over, girl. I'm here." My friends, I have read many reunion stories. I have never encountered 4 words that did more work. It is over, girl. I'm here. 60 years of separation. 60 years of carrying someone in your heart without knowing if they were alive or dead, well or suffering, remembered or forgotten. And the first thing he said to her, this 85-year-old man holding a 65-year-old woman who had once been a 5-year-old child in the snow, was not, "I found you," or "I missed you," or "Do you remember me?" It was, "It is over. I am here." As if everything that had passed in those 60 years was simply a long interruption and something that had never really stopped. In 2017, their story became a film. Ayla, The Daughter of War, a Turkish and South Korean co-production directed by Can Ülkay. At its world premiere in Istanbul, the real Suleiman and the real Kim Eun-ja walked onto the stage together. The audience, who had just spent 2 hours watching their story, looked up and saw the people themselves, standing there, alive, holding hands. Turkey submitted the film as its official candidate for Best Foreign Language Film at the Academy Awards. I want to tell you something else, something I learned while preparing tonight's story. Kim Eun-ja. Ayla passed away in 2025 at the age of 80. She did not live to see the full legacy of the story she and Suleiman had made together. But in the years between their reunion and her death, she wrote him letters. She called him her father. She called his wife her mother. They visited each other. They sat together in rooms and remembered. They got their time in the end. Not enough time. It is never enough time. But they got it. Now. I know that some of you will want to see the film for yourselves, and you should. It is beautiful. You can watch it for free right now on Plex. Just search for Ayla, The Daughter of War. It is also available to rent or buy on Apple TV. I will say this. Do not start watching it if you are not prepared to cry. Consider yourself warned. My dear friends, I want to leave you tonight with one small thought. Suleiman Dilbirli was 25 years old when he found a 5-year-old girl in the snow. He had no obligation to her. No one would have blamed him for walking past. The war was loud and cold and full of demands on every soldier's attention. He had enough to carry. He picked her up anyway. And 60 years later, those 4 words, "It is over, girl. I'm here." Every act of love casts a shadow forward in time. We rarely see how far that shadow reaches. Suleiman did not know, on that night in 1950, that he was beginning something that would outlast the war. Outlast the cold. Outlast 6 decades of silence. Outlast everything. Except the human heart's extraordinary refusal to forget the people it has chosen. He just picked up a little girl who needed carrying. That was enough to change everything. Thank you so much for spending this evening with me, my dear friends. Until next time, take care of each other. That is always the answer. Good night.